I call to order meeting number 7 of the 73rd session of the committee. It's my great pleasure to welcome again this morning the distinguished delegation of China and the head of delegation, Mr. Chen Xu, Ambassador and Permanent Representative of China to the United Nations and other international organizations in Switzerland. I would also like to welcome all those observing the dialogue here and via webcast. Before giving the floor to the delegation for the continuation of the dialogue related to the consideration of the third report of China, of which the reports of Hong Kong, China, and Macau, China, I would like to start by inviting Mrs. Preeti Saran to pose questions on Cluster 4. Then we will invite the committee to ask follow-up questions to Cluster 1 and 2 for a maximum of 20 minutes. After that, we will invite the delegation to respond to questions from Cluster 3, which were posed yesterday at the end for a strict maximum of 30 minutes. We later invite the delegation to respond to questions from Cluster 4 for a maximum of another 30 minutes. After that, the committee will ask follow-up questions on Cluster 4 and proceed immediately to ask follow-up questions to all clusters. Then we invite the delegation to reply to all follow-up questions. To facilitate this process and enable us to cover the full range of issues at hand, I would like to invite my colleagues and the distinguished delegation to speak in a concise manner, giving due attention to time limitations. With this, I have the pleasure to give the floor to Ms. Preeti Saran. Ms. Preeti Saran, on Cluster 4, that's right to education, the right to take part in cultural life, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning to the distinguished delegation of China. Thank you for a very constructive dialogue yesterday and look forward to continuing our discussions this morning. Your Excellency, I'll begin with Cluster 4 and move on. So as far as Cluster 4, which relates to the right to education and right to culture and benefit from scientific progress are concerned, on the right to education, Excellency, there are concerns relating to reduced expenditure allocated on education, that compulsory education is not completely free, and on issues of disparities in access to basic education between children of ethnic minorities and Han Chinese population groups, between urban and rural residents, including rural to urban migrant workers. We are informed that there has been a gradual erosion of Tibetan language, religion, and culture in imparting education in the Tibetan Autonomous Region as a result of bilingual policy of the government and the push for unified curriculum and the National Common Language Policy. In fact, 3 UN rights expert committees, including our own committee, have repeatedly expressed concerns regarding handling of mother tongue instruction and have called upon the government to ensure that Tibetan children are able to learn their own language. Since 2003, ethnic Chinese primary school teachers who do not speak Tibetan are being sent to Tibetan schools using Chinese for instruction in the Tibetan region. Even kindergartens in ethnic minority areas use Chinese as a medium of instruction. Tibetan children as young as 4 to 6 years of age are being sent to boarding schools where they are completely deprived of access to their language and their culture. So my questions are, Excellency, could you kindly provide data on the number and percentage of schools in the Tibetan Autonomous Region that use Chinese both in primary and at other school levels? Next, are Tibetans allowed to run private Tibetan language schools? Are parents and families subjected to reprisals if they do not consent to placing their children in residential schools? Who takes care of the education and upbringing of children whose parents have been sent to re-education camps? What are the reasons for rescinding the social security benefits of Mongolians who refuse to send their children to school because of a newly implemented policy in Inner Mongolia? Moving on to Hong Kong, Excellency, could you kindly respond to reports that the national security laws and ordinances have limited academic freedom, as also cultural expressions, theatre, arts, satirical content, content on radio and television? We understand that books and syllabus have changed, thereby removing large parts of cultural history and also other subjects in the curriculum. Widespread censorship limits enjoyment of scientific progress. Is there a concern that this will stifle creativity as also freedom of expression? In Macau, how would State Party respond to reports that there has been a decrease in net enrollment rates at the pre-primary education level, where the children of migrants are underrepresented? Yesterday, Excellency, we were informed that Chinese law does not recognize LGBTQ rights in LGBTQ as a gender. In which case, what measures are planned to protect LGBTQ students and their human rights in schools? In its report, the State Party has stated that cultural rights of ethnic minorities are protected, including protection of cultural heritage and diversity. The UN Special Procedure mandate holders, however, have expressed concerns on states' interference and undermining in a discriminatory way of religious traditions and practices of Tibetan Buddhists and other minorities. The new measures on the administration of Internet religious information services came into effect in March 2022, prohibiting individuals or groups from teaching or otherwise propagating religion online without official approval. Now, this places a major restriction on religious freedom. We've also seen reports of large-scale destruction of Uyghur cultural landmarks, including satellite imagery, which shows widespread destruction of mosques, graveyards, and shrines. The Hotan Prefecture Education Department has banned the use of Uyghur language at an education level in favor of Mandarin. So my questions are, how has the State Party ensured that ethnic minorities, notably Tibetans, Uyghurs, Hui, Kazakhs, Mongols, fully exercise their right to preserve and participate in their cultural life, including using and teaching their own languages, history, and culture, as well as practicing their religion freely, without state's interference or retribution, amid avid measures taken to sinicize them and imbue them with Chinese characteristics? Next, the ethnic and cultural profile of ethnic minority regions has changed by forced resettlement of traditional pastoral land minority grazers and by encouraging Han Chinese to settle in ethnic autonomous regions by giving them incentives, thereby impinging upon the local language and cultural practices of the region. So my question is, could you kindly provide disaggregated data on the changing demographic profile of the minority regions over the last 5 years? Next, what measures have been undertaken to ensure that the ethnic unity law is not abused as a tool to persecute minorities in enforcement of Han-centric identity and way of life? Next, what steps are being taken to strengthen respect for cultural differences within state parties' national territory? Has any analysis been undertaken on the adverse impact of the May 2020 National Unity Model Areas Regulation on enjoyment of educational and cultural rights of ethnic minorities? Next, what measures have been undertaken to ensure participation of minorities in formulating policies protecting their freedom of expression, their religion, their language and culture, including right to worship their religious leaders and the sacred religious practice of incarnation among Tibetans, display of prayer flags, circumambulating around temples, etc., which they are prohibited from doing? What are the reasons for disallowing Tibetan festivals like Saga Dawa in Tibetan schools? Yesterday, Excellency, we were informed by the State Party that the re-education camps are not detention centers, nor are they being used for forced labor. What is the criteria for evaluating and sending members of the minority community to re-education camps and vocational training camps? Is it based on their religious faith or cultural practices? If these are merely for educational institutions and there is no coercion, then why have they been secured with high security walls, barbed wires, surveillance cameras, etc.? Next, how is it proposed to protect cultural rights embedded in the covenant while researchers have documented the destruction of thousands of Uyghur mosques, shrines, etc., including the 800-year-old Keria Atika Mosque in Xinjiang, which was destroyed in 2018 despite being identified by the state party as a cultural heritage site in 2017? Have demolished monasteries and mosques been rebuilt? What are the measures adopted to distinguish between radical and regular expressions of Islamic faith by Muslims in Xinjiang? Yesterday, we were informed that minority communities can practice their religion at homes. Why then are there restrictions in keeping a Quran or observing cultural practices or rituals for marriages, births, and funerals among the ethnic minority communities? Why does the 2017 regulation on de-radicalization in Xinjiang prohibit Muslims from keeping Islamic names for their children or for keeping beards and some other, or even observing the holy fasting during the holy month of Ramzan? And how does the state party guarantee freedom of expressions, assembly, and association, including in Hong Kong, and remove obstacles to freedom of information on the internet? Excellency, this comes, Mr. Chairman, this comes to the close of my questions on cluster 4. But since I have the floor and the time, I'll just quickly move on to some residual follow-up questions, which you have kindly allowed us. So my first question, Excellency, is yesterday we had heard the state party's response to the legislation introduced to protect women from sexual harassment at work. In spite of this, we have received numerous reports about non-implementation of the legislation, primarily on grounds of insufficient information. So my question is, what steps has the state party undertaken to vigorously implement all legislation to address cases of sexual harassment, as also address problems of forced marriages, human trafficking, gender disparity in wages, and also to ensure a larger participation of women in senior political, administrative, and decision-making positions? Yesterday, we also heard your response to our efforts at international cooperation in sharing data on COVID pandemic. In December 2022, the WHO had renewed its call on China to share up-to-date COVID prevalence and impact data and participate in the conduct of WHO studies. WHO also stressed the importance of transparency and regular sharing of data to formulate accurate risk assessments and inform effective responses, both global and national. Could you kindly confirm that this is being done, particularly in the wake of the recent spike in COVID cases in China? Next, has an impact assessment been undertaken by the state party on the government's zero COVID policy, and how did it violate or impinge upon the economic, social, and cultural rights of its population, particularly the poorest and the most marginalized? Next, please provide more information on the grid-style management and network-style construction of labor security supervision described in para 59 of your state report. What specific punishments are handed down as a result of the investigations conducted by the labor security supervision institutions into more than 1 million illegal acts mentioned in para 59 of the state party's report? Measures taken to regulate the recruitment process of Chinese workers sent overseas, could you kindly share, so that to ensure that they are entitled to the protection of labor contracts with their legal documents secured and that they are not exploited? We would welcome receiving concrete data to substantiate the steps taken by the state party in this regard. Next, please provide disaggregated data to show the number of ethnic minorities employed by the government in state-run enterprises and in private businesses, and as percentages of the total employment numbers in these sectors in Xinjiang, Tibet, and the Inner Mongolian Autonomous Region. And finally, Excellency, my last question, can the state party provide information on the total number of nomadic Tibetans who have been subjected to relocation and resettlement programs? Has it been voluntary? And those relocated were informed in accordance with international standards? Can the state party provide statistics regarding cases filed by these affected Tibetans in administrative courts against relocation measures? And did they have an independent judiciary attending to their cases? Can the state party provide data on living standards, including income statistics of resettled nomadic Tibetans? Thank you so much.
I thank Ms. Preeti Saran for the questions she posed under Cluster 4 and the additional questions she just asked. Now the floor is open to committee members for follow-up questions to clusters 1 and 2. Any questions, colleagues? I give the floor to Mr. Winford. Mr. Winford, you have the floor.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks for the possibility for some follow-up questions concerning the discussions yesterday. My first goes back to the issue of climate change. I might have overheard it, but at least I posed some questions. First, how you want to more ambitiously try to reach the Paris Agreement emission targets in all 3 territories. In a way, that was a question. And also, more and more important is the issue of the climate adaptation. You are reporting in your list of issues to this. But what are the areas where adaptation is most in need, and how you have to respond as a country to this? That would be of interest for the committee, because in more and more countries it becomes very relevant for the implementation of economic, social, cultural rights. My second question relates to the independence of the judiciary. We would have an interest to see how the selection process of judges is done in China, particularly for economic, social, cultural rights cases such as labor rights, trade union issues organized, and how much you are investing in making these judges and legal institutions aware of economic, social, cultural rights. Related to this is also the question of what we heard yesterday. Sometimes there is an open definition of what is national security in many instances. We have the feeling everything could become suddenly a security issue. How to plan to make it a more like a legally binding definition, which becomes clearer that there is not so much space for arbitrary decisions. Yeah. In this context, for example, there is an illustration for an open for this in regard to the case of the former Hong Kong Confederation of Trade Union chairman, who has not been released on bail unless the judge is satisfied that the person would not commit again on acts that would endanger national security. If the case is not clarified what is really meant with this, it can be very arbitrarily. In that sense, also the question is, again, on the case of Hong Kong, if the Committee on Safeguarding National Security, who has the power to decide what is a matter of national security, also can change court decisions when an issue becomes declared being of relevance of national security, just to how to make sure that this is limited and not becomes an arbitrary definition, both in Hong Kong, but particularly also with your national legislation at the mainland. Maybe linked to the Hong Kong, there's also one additional question. We have received information that citizens can call a hotline at the national security policy when somebody is acting against the proclaimed national security concerns, be it academics, teachers. So we would be interested how many cases you have received, how you follow up these cases, particularly with relevance to economic, social, and cultural rights. And the last question I have to the vocational training centers in the Uyghur province. I think we had yesterday an explanation from, was it Mr. Louis, if I remember correct, who said that these are basically for training efforts. They are now, at least in international media, available studies of the University of Sheffield and others who have done a lot of, let's say, even satellite photos, that they are all placed just directly at the line of coal mining sites, factory parks in the province. So the idea that this is linked to forced labor is very obvious. So is there something happening like this? I just want to get more clarity on this. And also, you mentioned that these training centers are not open for visitors, particularly adults from abroad or outside the region. At least on the, let's say, UN Business Forum on Business and Human Rights, we learned also that, for example, the whole region is now no longer open for, let's say, audit forums companies who are wanting to investigate the situation concerning forced labor and in the region. So is that correct? And how to allow others to have more scrutiny on these things would be an interesting issue from my side. That's for the moment. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
I thank Mr. Windfor. Please, colleagues, any follow-up questions under clusters 1 and 2 still remaining? Yes, members of the committee. Any members of committee wish to? Yes, I think Ludwig, Hannibal, Mr. Hannibal, you have the floor. We're using first names here.
Thank you, Chairman, for giving me the floor so that I could raise another follow-up question. This sort of dialogue, as you've said, is that we should try to identify structural problems and the reality of any allegations regarding violations, and possibly envisage a way of addressing these so that there will be reforms, amendments, the right to truth, judicial guarantees, effective remedy, etc. Within any structures, any community, there's going to be dissidence, there's going to be opposition. As part of our dialogue, we continue to invite the state to not necessarily confirm as such the reality of these broadly documented allegations, but see where we can find solutions so that we can address these allegations. I had quite a few follow-up questions, and Chair, I reserve, if necessary, the right to go back to these if necessary. Thank you, Chair. First of all, forced assimilation of minorities. I am using UN terminology used by colleagues, particularly special rapporteurs, February 2023, many rapporteurs of the UN. Actually, there was a press release, and apparently 1 million children from the Tibetan minority are affected by Chinese government policies to assimilate them culturally, linguistically, religiously. We've heard about these boarding schools that they're sent to. And I quote, "This is deemed to be an assimilation policy whereby the Tibetans are assimilated into the majority." And this is addressing religious and linguistic bodies in Tibet. I'd very much like to get your reaction to that point. It ties in with some of the points that have been mentioned just now by my colleague under Cluster 4. And I'm looking forward to hear you answer those questions under Cluster 4 later on. My second question on forced labor. I'm rather surprised at the information that we're getting from you. This is broadly documented practice, and I'm rather concerned that the government really seem to be aware, or at least be aware of the scale of the concerns that this generates. These are practices which occur on your territory. So I would like to invite the government to take this opportunity to fully cooperate with the UN in this regard in order to have investigations and shed light on these allegations. I'd like to know where you stand with any investigations, if there are investigations that you have launched into forced labor. Have you, for instance, set up a commission of inquiry, an independent one, to look at this, some sort of committee that could cooperate further with UN experts and other UN bodies to clarify affairs? On forced labor, I think a member of the delegation answered a question saying that these professional or vocational training centers exist. the offences are minor and do not constitute crimes. I'd like to know what is the jurisdiction governing these centres if you have this sort of conviction or sanction handed down. And the trainees that have been mentioned, and again, I'm saying trainee inverted commas, are they able to say whether they accept such a training or is it forced on them? On human rights defenders, lawyers, can you confirm that the state also carries out effective inquiries, not into enforced disappearance, but arbitrary arrest of human rights defenders or lawyers? When you have this sort of allegation, in principle, there is an ex officio obligation to conduct inquiries and investigations into alleged violations. So it would be good to know if there are effective investigations and inquiries into these allegations. Researchers have documented with satellite imagery the destruction of mosques, sanctuaries, and even Uyghur cemeteries. How do you intend to protect cultural rights in that regard? They are enshrined in the covenant. When there have been manifest proof of this destruction, and I think it's useful to look at that under the angle of our cluster 4, as well as cluster 2. So I just wanted to go back to that question since I've got the floor. And finally, Hong Kong. What measures are taken in order to effectively protect academic freedom, freedom of expression of students? And my final question on Macau. This has to do with the exclusion of migrant workers from being able to take leading roles in unions, trade unions, and more broadly, protecting domestic workers in the legal order of Macau. Many thanks for your attention.
Merci, Monsieur Nebel.
Thank you, sir.
Other questions by colleagues in the committee? Mr. Kune. Mr. Kune, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. Two short questions. One in relation to the vocational centers in the Uyghur region. It was mentioned yesterday, I don't recall the exact terms, but more or less that people are sent to the vocational centers because of what was referred to as minor offenses. So my question would be, can we please have full particulars of what are these minor offenses? What do they consist of? This is one. And then secondly, further to the questions which have been put by Mr. Hennebel, we have also been informed of the convictions for criminal offenses by defenders of human rights and for sanctions taken against lawyers. So my question will be simply this: can we have particulars of the charges, the factual particulars, making it quite clear? What were the facts which constitute the charges for these convictions? Not the findings, we know the findings. What were the facts which actually constitute the subject matter of the charges for such convictions or sanctions? Thank you.
I thank Mr. Kunai for his questions. Now I give the floor to Mr. Furio, and then, okay. Mr. Furio first, and then Mr. Mancisidor. Mr. Furio first.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman. Thank you for giving me the floor. My question has to do with something that's actually not present in the State Party's report. And I don't think there was any reference to this in the oral presentation. I'm really addressing the preparation of the report and the follow-up to recommendations coming from the committee. Pursuant to Articles 2, Indent 1 and 16 of the Covenant, I would like to ask the delegation a question on establishment of mechanisms that will follow up the implementation of recommendations. Now, in the State Party's report, it says that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs has taken an initiative to have consultations with a broad range of participants, with other governmental bodies in particular. And I think this is a practice which is very positive. However, my question goes beyond that. What happens after that? What happens after the committee has submitted its recommendations? Do you have a body that is specifically responsible for monitoring, follow-up, and recommendations? Thank you.
I thank Mr. Furio for his question. Any other questions by committee members on clusters 1 and 2? If none, I give the floor to the delegation of China, and now it's for organizational matters that they give their replies to cluster 3. Delegation, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just now, Mrs. Saram presented the 4th cluster of issues. I've taken good note of them. She also mentioned that our dialogue yesterday was constructive. I've also noticed that some members raised further follow-up questions. Some of them were covered yesterday, and some of them need further information. I want to say that where the shoes fit, the one wearing them knows the best. All ethnic groups in China have can equally enjoy all human rights, irrespective of regions, ethnicity, religion, and sex. China's national report contains detailed description of the efforts undertaken by China in this field. And yesterday, my delegation also provided further information in this regard. In today's discussions, my colleagues will continue to work in a constructive spirit and carry forward our dialogue. I'd now like to give the floor to my colleague from the Hong Kong SAR to reply questions related to cluster 3.
For the cluster 3 questions yesterday, we will now highlight our major policy measures in response to the relevant questions. First, on poverty alleviation. In 2020, taking into account various selected policy measures, including recurrent and non-recurrent cash assistance, as well as means-tested in-kind benefits such as public rental housing, the Hong Kong SAR government's policy intervention measures lifted a total of 1.1 million people out of poverty, reducing the poverty rate by 15.7 percentage points. Taking the various recurrent cash assistance schemes as an example, we have introduced substantial enhancements to the schemes in recent years. Major enhancements include merging the normal and higher OH living allowance with effect from September 2022, with the merged OELA adopting the more relaxed asset limits of normal OELA and the higher payment rate of higher OELA. Furthermore, the government introduced the Working Family Allowance Scheme in April 2018 to implement a host of improvements to the former low-income Working Family Allowance Scheme, such as relaxing its eligibility criteria and substantially increasing the rates of allowances so as to strengthen the support to lower-income working households. In response to the question on elderly services, we have always attached great importance to this.
Sorry, there's a request from the other interpreters. Could the speaker just slow down a little bit, please? Thank you.
Year is about 1.8 billion US dollars, representing an increase of over 80% that of 5 years ago. Our policy objective on elderly services is aging in place as the core, institutional care as backup. Elderly persons are eligible to apply for subsidized services, including both residential care services and community care services, based on their care needs regardless of financial background. Last year, there were more than 60,000 elderly persons receiving subsidized community care services, with the government shouldering more than 95% of the service cost. At the same time, there were about 60,000 elderly persons living in residential care homes for the elderly, with half of them receiving subsidized residential care service, under which 90% of the cost was paid by the government. We also announced the Elderly Services Program Plan in 2017 to enhance the medium to long-term planning for elderly services. Amongst the 20 recommendations of the ESPP, 12 have been completed or ongoing, while work for the other 8 has commenced. One important example of the government's implementation of the ESPP is the introduction of a bill which amends legislation regulating residential care homes for the elderly and persons with disabilities. The bill is intended to enhance the quality of such homes, covering such areas as enhancing the minimum staffing requirements, increasing the minimum area of floor space per resident, and strengthening the accountability of home operators. We will continue to enhance subsidized elderly services by regularizing the scheme on community care service voucher for the elderly this year and increase the number of vouchers in phases from 8,000 to 12,000 in the 25-26 financial year. On residential care services, our target is to provide an additional 60 to 100 subsidized residential care service places by the end of 2027. Lastly, to strengthen the protection and support to the elderly living in residential care homes during the COVID-19 epidemic, we enhanced the COVID-19 testing requirements for residential care home staff, put forward various rounds of vaccination program, and introduced measures to improve homes ventilation and infection control. We have also set up holding centers to provide better care and treatment for the infected, and at the same time protect the rest of the residents from infection. I'll now pass the time to my other colleague for response to other questions. Thank you.
To questions on healthcare services, it has been our policy that no one will be denied adequate medical care due to lack of means. All Hong Kong residents enjoy equal access to public healthcare services, which are highly subsidized by the government. Vulnerable groups who cannot afford healthcare services may apply to hospital authority for waiving medical fees. Notwithstanding the great pressure on the healthcare system during COVID-19, we continue to uphold the above principle and strive to meet the medical needs of all Hong Kong people through measures such as manpower deployment and enhancing cooperation with the private healthcare sector. Turning to questions on housing, our government is determined to rectify the housing problem faced by the public through a multifaceted approach. We continue to increase housing supply on the basis of long-term housing strategy. According to the latest housing demand projection in October 2022, the total housing supply target for the next 10-year period from 2023-24 to 2032-33 is 430,000 units, 70% of which, that is 301,000 units, are our target for public housing. We have already identified sufficient land for providing about 360,000 public housing units, which can meet the estimated public housing demand in a set 10-year period. As for private rental market, we have implemented tenancy control in respect of residential tenancies, as well as put in place regulatory regimes in relation to private developers and estate agents. to relieve the pressure on the livelihood of grassroots families that have waited for public rental housing allocation for a prolonged period of time, the government has launched a 3-year cash allowance trial scheme. As at the end of December 2022, our housing department had disbursed a total of around $2.53 billion in cash allowance to about 84,000 eligible public rental housing general applicant households. Thank you.
I thank you. Now I'll give the floor to my colleague from Macau SAR. He will reply the questions on cluster 3 together with some of the unanswered questions left over from yesterday.
I thank Mr. Kone for your questions. Macau SAR provides different types of subsidies to residents. The individuals and the families in difficulties could have access to further assistance. The disadvantaged families could have access to monthly allowances. The single-parent families with school-age children or with persons with disabilities could have access to more assistance. The Macau SAR give particular attention to the elderly people and people with disabilities with different allowances. In the regarding the rights and interests of foreign employees, they have equal rights of benefits, and they could be given benefits of transport. If employers or the job agency provides accommodation directly to employees, then the accommodation must meet a certain number of standards. We also do dissemination of labor rights and other knowledge to both employers and employees. Macau SAR also promote public housing schemes targeting people with different levels of assets and the people with difficulties. Since 2020, the application of social housing is in constant nature. By September 2022, the waiting hours of public housing is reduced to 8 months. During the waiting period, the relevant families could be given additional benefit. In addition, between public and private housing, we would like to have another layer of housing. The laws and regulations for this type of housing has been generally approved in the Assembly. Generally speaking, the Macau SAR plans to promote in order the social housing, economic housing, housing for elderly housing, and other layers of housing to meet the needs of people with different levels of financial status. My other colleague will further respond to other questions in Cluster 1 and Cluster 2. Chairperson and members, good morning. Regarding the questions in Cluster 1 and Cluster 2, I would like to continue my response. Some questions, I would like to combine them together to respond together. Regarding the anti-discrimination laws and elimination the discrimination in workplace, the Macau SAR guarantees all people within our jurisdiction, regardless of their language, religion, financial status, social background, and other status. Everyone is equal in front of law. Although Macau SAR does not have a specific law on anti-domestic issue, but we have basic law and other laws and regulations to formulate a legal system. To provide a sufficient foundation to eliminate discrimination in workplace. If employees feel their rights are violated, they could come to the authority to file a complaint. The authority will follow up the case. If the employer is found to violate the rights, they will be given punishment. The Labor Bureau also adopts further measures to prevent the discrimination in workplace. From 2019 to 2020, the Labor Bureau, as well as other governmental departments and non-governmental organizations, through different languages, 248 workshops have been convened to disseminate relevant knowledge. For people with disabilities, the expenditure and the insurance to this group of people, our government have different tiers to provide protection to people with disabilities. On the social protection layer, we have social insurance to provide the benefit. And the second type is provident funds to guarantee people's life after the retirement. In 2021, this expenditure accounted for 7.75% of the Hong Kong SAR's total expenditure. Also, allowance could be given to the persons with disabilities who meet a set of criteria. The amount is 9,000 per month. Person with disabilities, if the income is lower, if they're among the low-income group, they can be given further allowance. Also, Macau people have the rights and the freedom to participate and establish trade unions. Employers are not allowed to impede the employees from exercising their rights. Those who violate the regulation could be punished. Thank you for your response. Now, I would like to give the floor to my colleagues from Department of Disease and Healthcare to answer some questions. Here, I'd like to remind everyone, please answer in a concise manner so that we can have as many as possible colleagues to respond to questions. I thank Mr. Connor for your questions. As for the inequality in health systems between rural and urban areas, now we have a healthcare network consisting of provincial, county, and village clinics to ensure everyone can access to healthcare within 15 minutes. And another point is we further strengthen the medical staff. Now, the ratio of doctors has increased from 1.55 to 1.11 per thousand person. And in the same time, the level in urban areas remain more or less the same. Thirdly, we have major hospital assistance, mobile clinics, remote diagnosis, and other means to penetrate the quality healthcare services to localities. As for the payment of high cost of treatment in 2021, based on the basic medical insurance, China initiated a insurance on serious disease to reduce the personal burden on the payment of the high cost. Through the insurance on serious disease, in 2021, the rate of reimbursement increased for another 18% on the basis of basic medical insurance. Also, we have relief system. In 2021, the outpatient and in-hospital services have provided relief 101 million instances. Also, for families with difficulties, we are provided with relief. In 2021, 88.16 million people were benefited from this relief. China has also enacted our law protects all persons' right of birth giving. Everyone can freely choose their appropriate contraceptives, and we strongly prohibit any forced sterilization. China has also repealed the punishment on giving birth to more than too many children. On the mental health issue, China's law stipulates the treatment is based on voluntary basis. If the patient is sent to hospital against their will, the patient themselves or the guardians could reject the decision and request for second diagnosis. If they still don't agree with the decision, they could invite a third party to do evaluation, and the relevant authority will carry out supervision in this regard. During the pandemic, we also set up a program on psychological counseling, targeting old people, children, pregnant women, people with disabilities, and other vulnerable groups. Based on the community, we provide in-time assistance to them. For the people with serious mental illness, we have documents to request to strengthen the treatment and care for them, both at home and in hospital. As for the healthcare during pandemic, we request all hospitals and medical facilities to have a fever clinic. Also, we have designated hospitals to receive the patients. Also, we prepared the facilities for to be able to use at any time. The local the medical on local level, the facilities and the medicines are in stock, and we have the capacity to meet the treatment of the whole population. Next, I give the floor to my colleagues in charge of education to respond to the questions in this regard. As for boarding school, In China, everywhere, all regions could be able to establish boarding school, including Beijing, Shanghai, and some other developed regions, as well as Henan, Sichuan, and some other less developed regions. Most schools have a mixed form. That is to say, in the same school or in the same class, those students who live in surrounding areas could live at home. For those students who live far away, could live in school. These two types of students receive absolutely the same type of education. For the students who live in school during weekends and holidays, they could go home to meet their families. Also, the parents could come to school to visit the children or pick up the students to go home. There is no so-called forced separation in the school. Here, I would like to point out, in China, 2/3 of the lands are in mountainous areas. So in the mountainous areas or some other areas with harsh condition, to establish boarding school, this could guarantee people's right to life and guarantee students' right to education. This will also help to reduce the burden on the families. Regarding the inequality of education between rural and urban areas, in 2015, we established a system to guarantee compulsory education. Between 2014 and 2021, the expenditure in education increased to 68.4%. And 100% of schools have internet connection. As for the integration between rural and urban areas, we promote the establishment of schools in villages and some small-scale schools. As for teachers, we unify the standard of teacher and improve the treatment, the benefits to the teachers. We also establish a digital platform to help with teachers' development. As for the caring system, facing to all students, we have improved the measures targeting the children accompanying their parents coming to urban areas and the children with disabilities. We also established a financing system from preschool education to postgraduate education to practically achieved leaving no student behind education. Also, we developed regions give support to less developed regions. Also, urban areas give support to rural areas. The graduate students and some retired teachers are organized to support the teaching in rural areas. In 2021, all provinces in China have achieved free compulsory education. This shows that the universalization of the compulsory education in China, as well as the equality between different regions. For the children coming with their parents to move to urban areas, they can equally have access to education locally. All the students could come into the local students without any test and on equal footing, to make sure all school-age children have access to education. In 2022, the expenditure, the central financial expenditure was 180 billion RMB. And 90% of the accompanying children could study in school and get the degree. This will create a better condition for them to continue their life in the urban areas. As regards the children with leprosy, according to China's law, all children with leprosy have equal rights to have access to education. No school should be allowed to reject the enrollment of children with leprosy. For these students, the school should adjust their management, targeting this group of students. In China, the vaccination of leprosy is provided free of charge.
等地呢，一些麻风病子女呢，也在就读。
In Guangxi, Yunnan, and other places, these children have difficulties. The local government has done a lot to improve the situation. Thank you. Thank you for the replies. Once again, I would like to remind the delegate members that because of time limit and in order for more people to have the chance to speak, so please try to answer questions in a succinct manner. Now give the floor to the Minister of Civil Affairs to answer questions in this regard. Please answer your questions within 3 minutes. Thank you for the questions. First, on the protection of the elderly in rural China. China attaches great importance to the protection of the elderly and has taken a lot of measures to protect their lawful rights. We have established the system of the government, the family, making joint efforts to help these people. According to the elderly rights law, social relief law, and other rules, we try our best to include those elderly in the scheme for minimum living allowance. We have basically improved the elderly pension subsidy system. Now it benefits 39 million people. And thirdly, we enhance the service for rural elderly. We have established a network for elderly service so that the rural elderly can receive professional help. And fourthly, we improve our care for the elderly during the pandemic. Recent years, due to the dynamic change of the situation and the vulnerability of the elderly with a lot of chronic diseases, we provide home visit and the care for the elderly confined at home so as to minimize the impact of the COVID and guarantee the right to life and health of these elderly. Concerning same-sex marriage and adoption of children. Concerning the registration of same-sex marriage, China's civil code provides that marriage is protected by law. China has this monogamous system, which requires that both parties to the marriage must apply and register. Therefore, the legitimate marriage certification in China refers to a marriage between man and woman. For the moment, we do not recognize same-sex marriage. Concerning adoption of children, according to the Civil Code, the family who adopted children should meet 5 conditions. 1, they have no children or have only 1 child. 2, they have the ability to raise, educate, and protect the adopted children. And thirdly, they must not have diseases. And fourthly, they do not have criminal record, which is not conducive to the healthy development of the children. Fifthly, they must be at least 30 years old. The code also provides that couples must both agree to adopt the children, and a single parent must be at least 40 years older than the adopted children. people who meet all these conditions are entitled to adopt minors. Thank you. Thank you for your reply. Now I give the floor to the United Front colleague to answer questions concerning ethnic minorities. Thank you, Mr. Corner, for your questions concerning population and family planning in Xinjiang. I have noted that in your questions yesterday, you used a lot of data and opinions, which mainly come from reports by Europeans in 2020. I have noted that when the report was released, people who are engaged in this kind of research wrote articles which responded to the data and opinion expressed there in the report. In 2021, the Chinese government, based on the 7th census data, wrote and released the white paper concerning Xinjiang's population, which in a systematic way showed the situation of the population in Xinjiang and respond to relevant data and comments in the area. I believe that any study or discussion concerning China's Xinjiang's population must take reference of China's official opinion and respond to information in the area. You can agree or disagree, but then you cannot selectively evade this kind of situation. Due to time constraint, it is not impossible for me to give a systematic elaboration of China's policies and response in the area. Concerning your questions and concerning the established research results, let me give you some answers. First, let me give you an idea of two background situations. The first one concerning the population of China's Xinjiang ethnic minority. The ethnic minority population has increased from 4.45 million of the 1953 first census to 40 million of 2027 census, an increase of 1.95 million from 2010 to 2020. And the population of workways increased from 3.6 million in 1953 to 11.62 million in 2020, an increase of 1.62 million from 2010 to 2020. This kind of range and space is really at the advanced level in the whole China. Second, concerning the family planning policy for Xinjiang, my colleagues already gave a comprehensive introduction of the family planning situation in China. In Xinjiang, the policy is applied first to the Han population and then to the ethnic minority. In fact, for a long period of time, the minority group enjoyed a relaxed policy. From the 1970s, the policy was applied to the Han people in Xinjiang. However, it was applied to the ethnic minority only in the 1980s, and they were simply encouraged to do so. In 1992, urban areas were allowed to have 2 children, herders could have 3, while in the rest of China, families could only have 1. In 2017, a unified family planning policy was applied throughout the whole Xinjiang. That is, city dwellers could have 2, urbans 3. In 2021, a unified 3-child policy was applied in Xinjiang together with the rest of China. I think that this question, population situation, should be understood in this context. Concerning forced sterilization in Xinjiang, we follow the policy of national guidance and of personal or voluntary choice. We, according to the law, practice family planning, and we prohibit forced contraception and forced prenatal check. People can have the freedom to choose their contraception measure. They cannot be forced to do anything. Women can, based on the physical condition, family condition, choose the method of contraception. In recent years, with the improvement of the status of women and the change of marriage, change of perception of marriage, more and more women tend to get married late and have child late, and they choose long-term contraceptive measures. Yesterday, I saw from the report that in 2018, most of the IUDs were used in Xinjiang, like 80%. This is very different from the real situation. According to statistics, in 2018, new cases of IUD was 3.77 million, and Xinjiang account for only 320 cases, a difference of 8.7%. Concerning the drop of population growth in southern Xinjiang, studies show that this issue should be regarded in an isolated manner. Rather, we should see it from a historical, relative, and a macro perspective. Indeed, the population in southern Xinjiang has dropped, but this is the case for the whole Xinjiang, and even for the whole China. This is a general trend of China's economic, social development, and population trend, and this is in line with the trend of the whole world. It should be emphasized that despite the situation, the population growth in Xinjiang still remains higher than the rest of China. In southern Xinjiang, in Kashi, Aksu, from 2010 to 2018, the population grew by 1.4 million. The southern Xinjiang was the fastest. The drop has something to do with has nothing to do with forced sterilization, arbitrary detention. Studies show that the policy of equal family planning was applied throughout the whole Xinjiang. Young people have different ideas of marriage and family. They pay more attention to higher education, vocational development, and also it has to do with the reduction of extreme poverty for women. There were also 2 questions concerning vocational training center. By 2022, concerning the data of these centers, already I give you a brief introduction of the situation. I would like to reiterate that by October 2019, members in these centers have all graduated. The number of these centers is dynamic. It is changing all the time. Now, the second point, the center is established for people is established to deal with the de-eradication. No one will be sent there because they violate family planning policy. The centers respect the basic rights of members. There are no cases of violation or maltreatment in these centers. Thank you. Thank you. Because of time constraint, and in order for the exchange to proceed smoothly, now this is the end of our answer to cluster 3 questions. For the rest of the questions, we will answer them at the end of the exchange. Now we come to cluster 4 questions.
Esteemed delegation, for the answers given to cluster 3. But there's still, the floor has to go to colleagues in the committee who want to pose follow-up questions on that cluster. Any of committee members wishes to pose follow-up questions on the answers given by the delegation of China on cluster 3. That is the family, adequacy of standard of living, and the level of health attained. I give the floor first to Mr. Kunai. Mr. Kunai, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. Only 2 small questions. One, only that we, unless it has escaped my attention, but it doesn't appear that there was an answer to a question which was put in relation to transgender persons, and which was to the following effect. Will you please provide information as to the measures in place to provide medical services appropriate to transgender persons and for any gender affirmation surgery or transgender hormone therapy? And secondly, further to questions which have already been put with regard to climate change, I have one specific question with regard to China's national strategy on climate adaptation 2035. Will you please tell us what is the progress achieved so far in the implementation of the plan, and for the timely implementation of the specific adaptation goals and plans so as to mitigate the adverse effects of climate change in the various areas which have been mentioned in the plan. Thank you, Chair.
I thank Mr. Kunai for the questions he posed. I give the floor to Mr. Winfor. Mr. Winfor, you have the floor.
Thanks. I have two follow-up questions related to poverty alleviation. First, I think maybe it's only on Hong Kong, but you might explain if this is also in the mainland. You are saying that you have more and more cash assistance programs, and you are saying that they are means tested, and I would be interested in getting to know what type of, how you do the testing, what is relevant for this tax declaration or whatever. That would be interesting. And the second is, I'm still a bit puzzled about the mix of poverty alleviation policies and the policies to promote ethnic unity. Yeah, this is linked in many of the things, and you have explained this. So it would be interesting for me, particularly on ethnic minority communities. So please provide statistics disaggregated to ethnicity, education, and income about those who have been dispersed for this ecological migration or domestic labor export policies for the target of poverty alleviation. Thanks.
I thank Mr. Winfor for his question. I give the floor now to Ms. Lee. Ms. Lee, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, the distinguished delegation. In relation to Article 12, the right to health, I would like to have a dialogue with you on public health measures in the context of COVID-19. I understand that the government of China has been making efforts relentlessly to protect people from the COVID-19 pandemic. Certainly, prevention, treatment, and control of disease is part of the obligations under the right to health. And public health measures may place certain restrictions on certain rights. Nonetheless, I would like to remind you that in accordance with the limitation clause of the Covenant, Article 4, and the general comment on the right to health, paragraphs 28 and 29, those restrictions must be proportionate and of a temporary period and must be subject to independent review. Moreover, people should be able to access to health information, be able to freely express their views on the measures affecting them. Even from the perspective of public health, when better informed, people can better protect themselves and others from health risks. In this respect, I would like to ask you first whether people can request a judicial or other independent review of the proportionality of a particular public health measure. And secondly, in present and future responses to COVID-19 or other pandemic health situations, whether the government is willing to design and implement the public health measures in a manner that fully considers the obligations under the covenant as a whole, with a particular attention to the impacts on people in vulnerable situations. In addition, as regards the protests against the restrictive COVID-19 measures, including the blank papers protests last November in major cities, I would like to ask the delegation about the numbers of the protesters taken into custody, what the charges against them were, and whether the government may consider dropping all the charges against any of those protesters who have expressed their views in a peaceful manner, unless the government has already done so. Thank you very much.
I thank Ms. Lee for the observations made and the questions she posed. Mr. Nantasut asked for the floor. Mr. Nantasut, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. Just one follow-up question on health. I would like to ask the delegation on the effects of registration of those who use drugs in China. We understand that people who use drugs, and this is a question whether they are registered to require them to undergo drug treatment and rehabilitation. And in that respect, we would like to ask further if such registration will impact the drug users who are registered the right to work, education, and health. In the case of registration in the database, this subjects those listed to periodic interrogation and urine testing by public security officers as well. So the question arises whether this is true in fact and in law. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Namtasut, for the question you asked. Ms. Russi asked for the floor. Ms. Russi, you have the floor.
Presidente. Thank you, Chair. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the delegation from China. Thank you for all the information you've provided to our committee. I wanted to stress a issue which is related to the investment in Latin America in particular from Chinese banks and investment companies. We received information, rather worrying information, regarding the effects that these mega projects have and their impact on human rights in the communities where they operate, as well as an impact on their economic, social, and cultural rights. I'm thinking particularly of the rights of indigenous peoples. They are entitled to healthy environment, they're entitled to certain labor rights, etc. Some of these projects in countries such as Bolivia, Chile, Colombia, Ecuador, Bolivia, Peru, and Venezuela. We recognize that China has taken steps in terms of guidelines, the behavior of their countries abroad. And I think this is encouraging that those steps have been taken. At the same time, I think there is a shortfall when it comes to the impacts that we're seeing, and at least the complaints that we're registering regarding the impact of these companies. This is why I wanted to focus on specific tangible measures that are being adopted in order to implement monitoring mechanisms, effective oversight mechanisms, which would allow you to supervise and sanction any violation of human rights which stem from the activities generated by Chinese companies outside the territory of China. Similarly, what measures are being adopted to establish real fora for dialogue between Chinese banks and funding bodies and the communities affected so that they can work out a solution to the negative impact brought about by these investments, and some also reparation and mitigating these negative impacts which have been imposed on the communities? And also, do you have oversight monitoring mechanisms in place to ensure such an impact is not repeated? In a similar vein, are measures being taken to set up judicial mechanisms which could take in complaints from these communities affected? I'm talking about the financial institutions in China, Chinese companies in China. And finally, are you considering making these guidelines obligatory in nature? I know since the start of 2000 there are certain guidelines, but could they be made obligatory? I'm also thinking about your general initiative that you have in place. And as I say, it has to do with banks as well as funding organizations in China.
Muchas gracias.
I thank you, Ms. Russi, for for the question she posed. Now I see Mr. Hannibal. Mr. Hannibal, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair, for giving me the floor again. I'd like to go back to two specific points, two additional questions that I'd like to put to the delegation. Yesterday, we talked about international cooperation as part of the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic. And we had, by way of answer, the fact that China did cooperate with all the relevant institutions, working, for instance, with the WHO, and did seem to take this cooperative approach. Perhaps we could think a little more collectively on the quality of this international cooperation, given the scale and indeed the global consequences of this pandemic. Perhaps we could contemplate working together on true international and effective cooperation. I want to know whether there is thinking on your side on a real stepping up of this sort of international cooperation so that everybody can truly work together transparently regarding the pandemic, so that one could, in the future, if necessary, have better cooperation in the future. My second question has to do with Article 11, an article which protects the right of everybody to have a sufficient standard of living, including for their family. This particular right has to be exercised in a very tangible fashion, taking into account the specific needs for individuals, but also ethnic groups, accommodating their cultural specificities as well as their religious specificities, should they wish to exercise those rights fully. So I just wonder how far you believe that that is compatible with China's international obligations regarding, as I said before, a sufficient standard of living. The fact that you have all these different programs that we know affect religious as well as ethnic minorities, particularly in Tibet and the Uyghur minorities. According to some allegations and to some information, they are uprooted. They are deprived of their possibility of fully exercising their rights, particularly within the family environment, and to be able to access decent standard of living, which is fully compatible with international human rights requirements. I look forward to your answer on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hannibal, for the questions. As arranged, the esteemed head of delegation, the delegation may proceed now to replies to questions on Cluster 4, as posed earlier by Ms. Saran. Delegation, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to ask my colleagues to answer questions under Cluster 4 raised by Ms. Saram. First, I'll give the floor to my colleague from the Ministry of Education. He will answer some of the questions under this topic. I would like to thank Ms. Saram for her questions. In answering Cluster 3 questions, I've actually covered some of the ground. Here, regarding compulsory education, inequality between villages and cities, and the problem of not entirely free compulsory education. Well, in state schools, the education is entirely free, with free textbooks and free tuition. In the non-state schools, the tuition is still on paid basis, but they make up less than 5% of the total education system, which is lower than the standard of OECD. At the same time, I must emphasize that those children who come with their parents as migrant workers, they can have free service provided by the government. As for the inequality between cities and villages, I actually made a detailed explanation in answering cluster 3 questions. At that stage, China practices entirely free compulsory education system, and we're trying to have equality between cities and villages. The next step is to optimize such efforts. Thirdly, as for the right to education of sexual minorities, according to China's education law and other laws, there is no distinction made about ethnicity, belief, and sexual orientation. They're all entitled to right to education, and that's no exception for sexual minorities. Students attending schools are treated equally, irrespective of their different status. I'll stop with this.
谢谢你的回答。
I thank you for your reply. Now, I'd like to give the floor to my colleague from the State Administration on Ethnic Affairs. I'd like to thank the committee members for your interest on the protection of the rights of ethnic minorities in China. I just now heard several questions concerning ethnic minorities. To sum up, they can be classified as 3 or 4. Firstly, the schools in ethnic minority areas, they practice bilingual teaching. That is, they teach 2 languages. One language would be the commonly used language in China, that is required by the national constitution. The second language, of course, would be their own ethnic language. This is also required by the law. And the national coffer has accordingly provided resources for the education in ethnic minority languages. We have special fund to support the editing of textbooks in ethnic minority languages and training of the teaching staff in this field. In ethnic minority areas, all the minority students can learn in classroom all the required lessons in curriculum, in terms of from what age school children will receive bilingual education. Different regions have different practices in light of their own prevailing circumstances. But on the whole, at the national level, we also have standardized textbooks, which are also used in ethnic minority areas. This is for the purpose of raising the overall standard of education. In some schools, in carrying out bilingual education, perhaps they would feel that the national common language, the characters of the Chinese language, are quite difficult to master, especially when the kid is still young. If the children can learn at early stage when they are still sensitive to the sounds of the language, it'd be easier for them to use the language afterwards. The state is doing its best to ensure that the ethnic minorities have the right to receive education in 2 languages. There's no change in such a policy. In fact, in some schools, 3 languages are taught at schools. I would also like to add that in terms of education of ethnic minorities, we have had a lot of changes taking place in China. Starting from 2016, college graduates coming from ethnic minorities now make up a bigger portion of the total students population, which is much even higher than the proportion of those ethnic groups in China. Secondly, as for the protection of the traditional culture of ethnic minorities, we also have laws in place, both in terms of constitution and the law on ethnic autonomy and the law on protecting non-material cultural inheritance or intangible cultural inheritance. We all emphasize on protecting the culture of ethnic minorities and have taken lots of measures covering mass media and other areas. Just now, actually, this morning, my colleagues presented some information concerning Xinjiang and Tibet in terms of the use of their own ethnic languages. They have their own newspapers, journals, and broadcast programs in their own languages and books published in Tibetan and Uyghur. There are also some national projects underway to further encourage such practice. For recent years, every year there is a song and dance competition held at the national level involving ethnic minorities. And that also takes place at the county and provincial level. It happens once every 4 years. The purpose is to encourage the popularity and the awareness of the ethnic minority culture. My third point, some experts raise the concern that the Han's are resettling in ethnic minority areas, and that might have an impact on the protection of the rights of ethnic minorities. That question actually doesn't arise. We just had the 7th national population census, and the census indicates that there is no obvious changes in the composition of population in those areas. The only difference is actually the growth of the ethnic minority population is faster than that of the national average. The Han's in China over the past 10 years rose by 4%, while the ethnic minority population rose in the same period by over 10%. That also applies to Inner Mongolia. Now, the Mongolians make up a greater portion of the population in those provinces and autonomous regions. That also applies to Xinjiang. Just now, I also heard a general concern, that is, the ethnic minorities in China under the current system might suffer from discrimination. Personally speaking, I don't think that's the case. On the contrary, they receive some special treatment and enjoy a higher status. All the laws in place in China prohibit any unfair treatment of ethnic minorities. For its part, the central government has also set up a lot of positive measures in favor of ethnic minorities. Therefore, in China, I think that the ethnic minorities enjoy a good status, and that status is well protected. I have some interesting figures to give you in this regard. The intermarriage between the Han and ethnic minority families, when it comes to the choice of the nationality or the ethnic identity of the children, once the child reaches the age of 18, he is entitled to choose. He can either choose Han or ethnic minority origin. According to our recent statistics, Perhaps the child was given the one ethnic identity at the time of birth. When he reaches the age of 18, he may very well change his mind and wants to take another ethnic origin. For instance, in 2021, those who asked to change the ethnic origin make up about 99% of the 99% of the children want to change the ethnic identity originally given by their parents. Actually, most of them prefer to have the ethnic minority in their origins because they can have better treatment. I thank you.
Anything? No? Yeah. 好，谢谢刚才的回答。
I thank you for your reply. There are still some specific questions left concerning the specific issues of ethnic minorities. Perhaps I can ask my colleague from the Office of United Front to give some replies.
I thank the members for your interest on education and cultural protection and religious freedom in Tibet. Now I would like to briefly introduce about these issues. Just now, my colleagues have made an introduction on the general education and education on ethnic minority groups. And my response is just to focus on that situation in Tibet. Currently, schools in Tibet conduct education teaching in 2 languages, which is conducive to the students' future development and is conducive to the economic social development, as well as the passing down of the Chinese languages. The policy is not just targeted to one particular ethnic minority group and will not undermine the position of the minority groups. Instead, it will help promote the communication among all groups and will be conducive to students' development. The only difference is in mathematics, chemistry, and science disciplines, because in Tibetan language, they do not have a specific term in the science field. As a result, for the education of these science disciplines, the education is conducted in the common language. As also, the school, the education is delivered by the Tibetan teachers. In Qinghai, the teacher training universities and some other universities, the Tibetan language is an independent subject. Every year, graduates from this faculty will come to join into the teaching staff in Tibet. Now, over 30,000 teachers are capable of delivering the bilingual education in Tibet. This is the information I'd like to add in terms of the education in Tibet. The establishment of non-state schools in Tibet, as long as they're in line with the government requirements, it is allowed to establish the non-state schools in Tibet. The members also mentioned about the boarding school in Tibet. The boarding schools in China means the school provides the accommodation and food services to students. It is not a closed service. It's fundamentally different from the boarding school during the colonial era. For Tibet, due to the plateau situation. The amount of oxygen is comparatively lower. I've been to that area to do research, and I found the height of the local students is generally lower than the students in other areas. And the people scatter in different areas. So these students, it's difficult for these students to go to school, and it's difficult to guarantee the quality of education. In order to guarantee all students have access to quality education, Tibetan government established boarding school according to the local requirement. Now we have 16,000 boarding schools around the country. In Tibet, there are about 800 boarding schools. Due to its local condition and the scattering of the population, the percentage of boarding school and the number of students in the school is comparatively higher than other regions. The fees of the accommodation and food service the school is responsible for the cost of accommodation and food services. The parents have parents committee, and the schools have open day. These are the events. These are the opportunities for the parents to participate in the management of school affairs. Students can go back home during weekends and holidays. The parents can come to school to visit their children and can take their children home. Schools have bilingual teaching. They also have some classes of cultural traditional culture. Students can dress in their cultural costume. Such boarding schools can effectively guarantee the health of students and enhance the academic performance of the students. Taking example of Ali region in Tibet, it's within Lhasa, the city of Lhasa. The altitude is above 4,000 meters. And there is a boarding school established in Ali region. It's called Middle School, Lhasa Ali Middle School. Between 2017 and 2019, 98% and 95 and 94% of students enrolled into universities during the 3 years. Through such boarding school system, Tibet guarantees the children of the farmers and nomad families to have access to education. This is the information about the boarding schools in Tibet. Also, the cultural protection in Tibet. China attaches great importance to the development of Tibetan culture. We fully respect the local culture. The local residents, according to their own view, still maintain their traditional culture and celebrate their own festivals. And secondly, the cultural heritage, China has made lots of efforts to save and maintain those culture. We have established a specific unit to survey the cultural heritage and collect the literature and other artworks. Now we have over 80 traditional theaters and 1,177 local artists. we also collected a number of Tibetan literature. Also, we give attention to the protection of the Tibetan folks. We, with a large amount of investment in this regard. Also, we developed the researchers in the field of Tibetan culture. By establishing a number of institutions and developing a number of experts and researchers. Also, as for the freedom of religion, now in Tibet to have 1,700 religious places with different religions such as Catholics, Christian, all religions are respected equally, and all rights are protected according to the law. Tibet has Association of Buddhism. Local people have the temples are well maintained and protected. Every year, China invests a certain number of amounts for the maintenance of the temples. The scriptural study system of the Buddhism is well protected. In the city of Lhasa, the institution of Buddhism is renovated. That's the information I would like to introduce. If there is any other information to add, maybe we can do the addition in the last section of the meeting. Now I give the floor to colleagues from Hong Kong SAR.
Thank you for members' comments on the Hong Kong National Security Law. The Hong Kong National Security Law has clearly stipulated 4 categories of offences that endanger national security. Such offences are clearly defined and are similar to those in the national security laws of other jurisdictions. The elements, penalties, mitigation factors, and other consequences of the offences are clearly prescribed in Chapter 3 of the National Security Law. Law-abiding people will not unwittingly violate the law. The Hong Kong National Security Law does not affect the legitimate rights of the residents in the Hong Kong SAR to exercise freedom of speech, including criticizing government policies or policies and decisions made by officials. Neither will freedom of information, academic freedom, policy studies, personal data privacy, and general business activities be compromised. Nevertheless, such rights and freedoms are not absolute. If illegal acts are involved, they can be restricted by the law. We will further respond to the follow-up questions on the Hong Kong National Security Law under clusters 1 and 2 later. And I will now pass on to my colleague to respond to other questions.
Thank you. Regarding members' questions on academic freedom, we would like to respond by stressing that academic freedom is an important social value treasured by the Hong Kong SAR, as well as the cornerstone of our higher education sector. The Hong Kong SAR government attaches great importance to upholding academic freedom and institutional autonomy as manifested by the fact that both are enshrined by the Basic Law under its Articles 34 and 137. Moreover, our citizens' freedom of expression is protected under Article 27 of the Basic Law, and that protection covers our students as well. These specific and clear safeguards have not been altered in any way and remain in full force. Specifically, in the publicly funded higher education sector, All publicly funded universities are statutory bodies with their own governing ordinances which set out their respective governance structures and provide them with the power and freedom to carry out their own objectives and functions. Funding for our universities is determined in accordance with the established mechanism rigorously calculated by the University Grants Committee. That said, neither the Hong Kong SAR government nor the committee specify how the universities allocate and deploy their resources internally for academic uses. Hence, the universities can decide how to make the best use of their allocated resources. As for members' concerns on the alleged censorship on textbooks, we wish to state that the Hong Kong SAR government does not compile or publish textbooks. A textbook review mechanism is put in place to ensure textbooks are of good quality and factually correct, and that they are in line with the curriculum rationale. Such review is undertaken by review panels comprising both internal and external reviewers. Review panels would relay comments to the publishers for their revision and would not require publishers to develop or draft textbook in any specific ways. Finally, we would emphasize that textbooks are only one kind of learning and teaching resource. Teachers can supplement and enrich the learning and teaching resources in accordance with the aims and objectives of the curriculum and the learning needs of students. Thank you.
谢谢。下面请澳门。
Thank you. I now give the floor to Macau SAR to answer some questions.
政府一向重视儿童接受教育的权利，对5岁到15岁的儿童强制实施义务教育，并采取不同的措施，确保适龄学童入学，包括
receive the compulsory education. Children between 5 and 15 years old receive compulsory education, and we adopt different measures to ensure the enrollment, the degree, and the evaluation of the quality of education. If any child between 5 and 15 has never registered in any educational facility, the government will urge the parents to register, to do the registration. For students with difficulty, they can apply for assistance and other allowance. The preschooling education with the development of the Greater Bay Area and the communication among the 3 regions. Students going to Guangzhou for study can receive extra benefits. This may be another factor that affects the rate of enrollment in Macau. Those people coming to Macau, their students can also register in local schools. Thank you for your response. Now I give the floor to the United World Department to answer some questions regarding Xinjiang issues. I thank Madam Saron for your interest in the Xinjiang issues. I would like to respond to questions from 3 aspects. First of all, the freedom of belief and culture in Xinjiang. Xinjiang is a region with multiple cultures and the religion. It has Uyghur ethnic groups and Han groups and some other ethnic groups. Everyone's right is well protected. In terms of religions, different religions exist in Xinjiang. And for all believers, the freedom of religious belief is well protected. For example, a Uyghur person can choose to believe in Buddhism or Christian. anyone can anyone who did not have any belief in the past may choose to have a belief now. Uyghur people, according to their own Muslim tradition, they can have their normal religious events and activities at their will. The Muslim Association has also published Quran in different languages and other books in different languages to meet the needs of the believers. In the daily life, Xinjiang fully protect all people's traditional culture. In major cities, all people have a holiday to celebrate their religious events. Also,
这个政策至少到现在都没有变，
The ethnic minorities have their own cemetery. Some of them are located in close to cities. Of course, some of the cemeteries could be relocated, but then they are not demolished. Concerning marriage and funeral, concerning their traditional custom, these are respected. Concerning mosques in Xinjiang, there are a lot of mosques, and many of them are built in the 1980s or 90s. Some of them were built in poor quality. When there was earthquake or storm, then people's personal security was threatened. And some of them were not well designed, which is not convenient for people to go and do religious activities. So recently, at the request of local people, in line with urban planning, expansion, and other measures, and in order to improve dilapidated housing, the measures are well received by the people. Now the mosque in Xinjiang can fully meet the requirements of the people. Some mosques of historic nature and large scale, like the Ashkatikagar and other mosques, are very well protected and preserved, and they're functioning well. Concerning the training center, let me add some information. There was a question concerning why there are wires and the high walls around the centers. I think there's a misunderstanding. These centers are schools, and of course they need the necessary security measure for a school, but then we don't go beyond them. They're not like prisons and detention centers. If you go to China, you can see that many places like schools, offices, residential areas, they all have walls and even wires. These belong to safety measures, not detention measures. Concerning the students there, I would like to emphasize in 2019 October, up till that moment, all the students have graduated. We're talking about a situation before that period. The students there, their close relatives, their parents, their grandparents could be asked by people. In case of difficulties, the local residential committee and civil affairs department, whether commission can take care of those people on their behalf. Concerning de-radicalization, in Xinjiang, this is a measure that is not targeted at any specific religious belief. It is not targeted as Muslims. It is targeted at this situation, at the phenomenon. China already has a rather well-established system. We have law against the extremism and also the de-radicalization rules, regulations. We have clear definition as to what constitutes radicalization. This is different from normal religious activity. No one, because of fasting, because of its name, can be charged as an extremist activity. Thank you. Thank you for the answers. We have exceeded time limit. Now give the floor to the chair.
Well, once again, I thank the head of delegation for giving me the floor. And now I invite committee members to pose their follow-up questions on the replies given by the delegation to Cluster 4. Mr. Ran, you are the discussion leader on that. You have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. And Excellency, I'd like to thank you and your delegation for the responses that have been provided to the questions that I raised, and I really convey my deepest appreciations. I find that, of course, some questions have not been responded to, and I suppose it is the shortage of time that has prevented response to that. Of course, I also requested for some data, so maybe that can be sent to us subsequently. In terms of follow-up questions, I had several, but I'm also mindful of time. So I'll restrict it to just a few. First is, we heard about the Uyghur community's respect for their cultural rights, etc. Wanted to know that is there any university or centers for higher learning which impart education in the Uyghur language? That is one question. The second one, I had, of course, in my questions on the minority communities, also raised the issue about the Hui people. And I just wanted to know whether they also enjoy complete freedom in practicing their cultural and religious rights. On some of the clarifications provided to the issues of the education of Tibetans in their mother tongue language. I just wanted to, it was informed to us that the residential schools, even for little kids, the age of 4 to 6, exist because they cater to scattered population with difficult economic conditions. But then how does this reconcile with the data, which shows that 78% of Tibetan children aged 6 to 18 are in fact in residential schools? So that was my first question. Secondly, in the context of, the data, of course, I presume can be sent to us later. But I did not get a reply about whether Tibetan parents and the society can actually operate private schools to teach their language in their curriculums, and they have their own, so could that be confirmed? Also, could a clarification be given whether private, semi-private, and state-funded instructions in Tibetan languages are operational in China? How many? And how are the numbers have changed over the last 10 years? Has there been an increase? There's been a decrease? That would be a clarification I seek. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Ran, not only for the questions, but for being mindful of time, which an example to follow, of course. Now I give the floor to Mr. Winfur.
Thanks, Chair. I have one question concerning the right to the freedom or to enjoy scientific progress or the right to science, Article 15. I know that there has been in 2017 a National Intelligence Act. And as far as I've read that now all scientists must give all outcomes and information to the local authorities or to the authorities to be checked. And the question is, how is this influencing the freedom to enjoy scientific progress and to do research? At least I learned already that some of the international university partners are more careful in cooperation because they're afraid of being read everything in advance. So that would be a question on this issue. Thanks.
I thank Mr. Winfur for the question. Mr. Mancisidor asked for the floor, I believe. Mr. Mancisidor, you have the floor, please.
Gracias.
Thank you, Chairman. Two comments, if I may, a very specific one, and the other is very general in nature. The specific point refers to the teaching of sciences in minority languages. I think it's been said that science teaching is done in Chinese because of the limits within Tibetan as a language in order to teach sciences. Well, I wanted to share a personal experience with you. I come myself from a minority language region. Myself, 30 years ago, it would have been impossible for sciences to be conducted in the Basque language, for instance. There were real stereotypes prevailing, prejudices. Of course, the prejudice being imposed by the majority, the Spanish language, the Castilian language in my case. And they almost said it would be ridiculous to teach sciences or impart sciences in a minority language because they say, well, there wasn't a scientific tradition in Basque, etc., and therefore it didn't have certain terms. But these are international terms. 30 years on, we see language normalization of this language, which means that all subjects, all scientific subjects, even at university level, doctorate, PhDs, can be taught in that minority language. Research can be carried out, excellent, top-notch research. So I wanted to pass on my personal experience in that regard. And I think one could learn from that. The idea that you cannot conduct science in a given language if it's a minority language, as I see it, simply carry on ideas and perpetuate ideas that are not correct. It's true that it requires additional effort. But I think this additional effort is part of what I term linguistic normalization. And I certainly would ask your government to perhaps consider that. My other thought, or rather question, far more broad-ranging, naturally, we read the State Party's report very closely. We look at your answer to the list of issues, your explanations. Here on cultural freedoms as well as educational freedoms, we've also read the National Action Plan in China 2021 onwards, and you have been kind enough to provide us with that action plan. In your action plan, when it comes to cultural rights, I think there are about 8 goals set out, very important ones, all of them. Better infrastructure, for instance, cultural diversity, which is extremely important. So all 8 of those goals are important. But when it comes to cultural diversity, cultural freedom, the right to participate in cultural life, as established per our covenant and our specific mandate, there is this idea of, and if you turn to para 3 of Article 15 of our covenant, you will see this. State parties commit to respect the freedom necessary for scientific research, creativity, etc., etc. And I just wanted to refer back to General Comment 21 of our committee, 2010. And in the paragraph dealing with specific legal obligations, para 49, it talks about freedom of opinion, freedom of expression in the chosen languages, freedom to create as part and parcel of specific legal obligations. If we go through the general comment a little more and move on to para 55 of that general comment, when it talks about the basic obligations, mention is made of respecting freedom of thought, freedom of expression, using the preferred language, freedom of association, freedom of peaceful assembly, establishing associations, etc. This is all part and parcel of the right to participate in cultural life. Amongst your 8 goals, I don't really see any referring specifically to that. So generally speaking, how does the state party understand this notion of upholding these freedoms as part of your action program on cultural rights? And in similar vein, and again, I'll be brief on this, right to education. I think there are 10 goals or targets established there. Again, the 10 are extremely important. You talk about investment, you talk about quality of education, etc. But again, no real mention is made of Article 13 aspects, Article 13 of the Covenant, that is. 3 and 4 of Article 13 state that states parties to the Covenant commit to respect the fact that parents can choose the necessary schools for their children, and nothing can be interpreted as a restriction on the freedom of individuals and bodies to establish and govern educational institutions. So again, bearing that in mind, how do you see the compatibility between these 10 very important goals that you have, and which we welcome, with these principles as established under Article 13 of the Convention? Thank you.
I thank Mr. Mancisidor for his intervention, for his comments, ideas, and advice. Any other? Yes, Mr. Hennebel asked for the floor. Mr. Hennebel, please.
Thank you, Chairman, for giving me the floor again. And I'd also like to thank the delegation for the answers they provided us with, particularly when it comes to the issues regarding the ethnic communities and regulations there. A range of colleagues have mentioned Tibetans, the Uyghur, and naturally a range of communities have been mentioned, not only Muslim communities, but in particular Muslim communities. And we've had answers from you where you basically are saying that you are respecting as far as possible the specificities, the particularities of these ethnic groups. However, I think we have to accept, and I'm sure you will see this reflected in a range of reports that have been submitted by many NGOs. You'll see this reflected in concerns expressed by UN experts and other human rights bodies. I'm sure you will grasp that your policies in this regard certainly are not generating any consensus, and I don't believe are getting the support of outside observers. Some indeed are wondering, and I just wanted to raise this with you, how far are these policies not actually counterproductive, giving the impression that certain policies adopted are trying to promote a mono-racial, mono-ethnic, non-diverse nation, which would be contrary to the prohibition on racial discrimination and against human rights values, which is exactly what we are discussing today. So I did want to go back to this specific point just to ask you clearly as to your thinking in this regard. Naturally, we've heard your position on this, and the adopted position. But what we're interested in is, in the light of criticism, and it is rather substantive and well substantiated criticism, is it not worth considering this? I'd like to know what your thinking is on this. And I also wanted to go back to another question which has just been mentioned now, and it's a very cross-cutting issue. This refers to the whole notion of detention centers, education centers, and indeed other centers that have been mentioned. And it really boils down to what is happening with your investigations. In other words, once allegations are made, the state, I believe, is duty-bound to carry out effective investigations. Now, you say that these allegations have no grounds, in which case, where do you stand with any investigation or inquiry? Are you carrying out any? If so, using what bodies? If you are using bodies, are they independent ones? Are these clearly independent magistrates and judges that are implementing rules in line with international rules and regulations? And again, I am keen to hear your answers on this. Thank you.
Merci, Monsieur Nebel. Now, last question will be from Mr. Winsford.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. I have one last question. Beyond Cluster 4, and this is maybe on an issue which many countries have, can you give us a short overview about the prevalence of corruption in your country and how you try to address it? We have read about a lot of maybe dealings with local corruption cases in your country. It was seen. Do you have an oversight mechanism, or do you want to establish one? And what are your amazing findings on that? That would be nice if time allows. Thanks.
I thank Mr. Wonderford for his question and for the statement, if time allows. And with that, I give the floor to the delegation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Now I'd like to ask my colleagues in the Chinese delegation to try as much as possible to answer all those questions left over from previous rounds. First, I give the floor to my colleague from the Foreign Ministry. Thank you. As for the question just raised by a committee member, we attach great importance to the concluding observations of the committee. The state organs and social organs all do their best to publicize the concluding observations. After the second review in 2014, the major concluding observations, such as doing away with the re-education through labor, anti-domestic violence law, 9-year compulsory education, all those recommendations have been implemented in China. That shows how much we attach importance to those concluding observations. As the next move, we will again use our coordinating body across different departments to have a deeper look at the concluding observations we're going to receive. So long as they correspond with the reality in China, we'll be quite willing to implement them. And we're also willing to follow them up with further exchanges and discussions. As for the question raised by Mr. Hannibal, indeed, China has ratified the 2 conventions concerning forced labor. As we have done in the past, we'll do our best to implement the obligations arising from those treaties. China is also keeping up with the human rights bodies under the Human Rights Council, we have very good relations of cooperation. The special procedures also enjoy good cooperation with us. In recent years, we have invited 9 special procedure mandate holders to visit China. And that figure is far higher than regarding other countries. We're also open to further visits from other mechanisms and the mandate holders who are free from prejudice. But we don't think there should be a presumption of guilt before the visit takes place. It must be based on mutual respect and trust. I also like to thank Ms. Rossi for her questions. The Chinese enterprises in their overseas operations have been receiving guidance from the Chinese government. We have been encouraging those enterprises to exercise their corporate social responsibility by respecting local culture, protecting local environment, and protecting the rights of local employees, especially by taking part in the development of the local communities and try their best to provide the welfare support in order to better integrate into local communities. In this process, we also try to protect the right to health of the indigenous peoples. Just now, you mentioned the several projects in Latin America. I don't have specific data on those few projects, but I have one on one project in Bolivia. There is a hydropower station called Ibilisu in Chinese. In 2021, it received some favorable comments from the owner of the enterprise, saying that the construction company has paid a lot of attention to protecting the environment to ensure that the quality of the project is well guaranteed and guaranteeing the local population's health. They also received some letters of thanks from nearby communities over their long-time free contribution of construction materials to local community. Those enterprises will continue to receive more instructions. Once a problem has been discovered, we'll do our best to correct them. We have also noticed that in today's discussion, many experts mentioned questions concerning Tibet and Xinjiang. We fully trust that you are people of integrity and you are independent. Therefore, perhaps it's good to listen to information from different sources. Some of the information sources are not exactly truthful to what is happening on the ground. We hope you will also pay attention to the feedback from China as well as from other sources so that we can better study those issues and receive some good suggestions from you. Thank you.
谢谢。下面请
I'd now like to give the floor to my colleague from the Supreme People's Court. I'd like to answer the question raised by Ms. Rossi concerning the violation of human rights of Chinese overseas enterprises. Does Chinese court handle those cases? It depends on where the violations took place. If it is abroad, then the local courts should be responsible for that. At this stage, we haven't handled any cases of this type. That was my answer to the first question. As for the question raised by Mr. Windfall on corruption, I have a brief answer for that. Overall, we are fully committed to fighting against corruption, and we want to move forward international cooperation in this field. We have in place National Inspection Commission, which carries out inspection of the whole civil service. We have also disciplinary measures in line with the United Nations Convention Against Corruption. We've also modified part of the criminal law. Recently, we have handled more than 360,000 civil servants who were accused of corruption. Just now, Mr. Wenfu also asked a question about the independence of the judiciary. According to our constitution, criminal law, and the criminal procedural law, people's courts are entirely independent in carrying out their duties, free from outside interference. In recent years, we have also taken some specific measures to ensure the independence of the courts. In addition, we have also set up the rule that the officials not directly involved with the cases cannot get involved, and the sentences are regularly published. We're also trying to encourage the judges to have a better awareness of the convention. In recent years, I've carried out several seminars and training courses covering more than 10,000 judges. The training course contains specific sections on the covenant. As for the specific crime charges, firstly concerning endangering national security, under Chinese criminal law, in first chapter, there are 12 offenses falling under that category, which have a specific explanation on the type of crimes covered under that, including subverting state powers, assisting or abetting such activities. Crimes are well established. We have sufficient evidence, and the whole procedure is totally transparent. The rights of the defendants were fully protected during those trials. I thank you. Now I'd like to give the floor to the Ministry of Culture and Tourism. I thank the experts for their questions. The question raised by Mr. Hannibal concerning the rights of culture of ethnic minorities. I believe that ethnic minorities in China enjoy the same rights as the other ethnic groups, especially in the field of culture. At the same time, governments at various levels also have specific policies to enhance the support and assistance to the cultural projects of ethnic minorities. On the one hand, we give more support to the cultural activities and facilities in ethnic minorities. Recently, we have transferred nearly 600 million yuan for such purpose. That is entirely earmarked for helping this building libraries and cultural houses in those areas, with a special emphasis on giving theater performances and other cultural products to countryside. We also are stepping up protection efforts of the ethnic minority culture. On the UNESCO heritage site, there are 43 projects in China, and 15 of them are in the minority areas. The culture successor listed by China also cover about 27% of ethnic minority successors. The protection areas in China in protecting intangible heritage, 11 of them are in minority areas, and they have received more than 700 million yuan as substance, as subsistence for that. As for the right to culture in the National Human Rights Action Plan, I'd like to mention 3 points. Firstly, we are stepping up the legislation and law in this field to better protect citizens' right to culture. We have recently published the law on library, on the movie industry. We're also trying to ensure that the cultural projects can be spread to grassroots areas. We are trying to standardize such practices to make them more equal, covering both cities and countryside. By now, we have set up libraries and cultural houses in every county. Even every village has a cultural house. And there are also cultural service centers numbering more than 570,000, which covers all area of China. The government is also trying to give more assistance to the cultural projects in poor areas by giving a lot of financial assistance to help them better beef up their cultural facilities. Thank you.
好，谢谢。我们的时间非常有限。
Well, we're running out of time. Could I ask my colleagues to be as brief as possible in your answers? Now, I'd like to give the floor to the Bureau on Disease Prevention and Control. I thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to briefly answer 3 questions. Firstly, Mrs. Sarang raised some concerns about the pandemic control in China. I'd like to answer from 3 perspectives. First, the transparency of information. Yesterday, I explained that China's pandemic is such that we have had a transparent cooperation with the international community, with many meetings and documents published. Even in last month, we had 5 meetings of this type. During the whole pandemic control process, we are stepping up our study of the pandemic and have been learning from the progress made abroad in trying to optimize disease control and the pandemic control. Our publication and regulations are constantly updated. The emphasis was on preventing contamination. Now it's over treatment. And the seriousness of the pandemic has been lowered. The measures are quite effective and fully in line with the prevailing circumstances in China. After our readjustment, the PRC tests have been abandoned. The scope of the testing has been narrowed down. Most people are encouraged to take self-tests at home. Even if the result is positive, they don't have to report to the authorities. And the patients can be treated in different medical facilities according to the seriousness of the symptoms. The report on infectious diseases in China are quite concrete, are based on real cases. It's not based on model. Actually, we don't have such a theoretical model because of the differences between the North and South. What we have now in terms of the infectious diseases data, you can find them in the website. As for the question raised by Ms. Li concerning the protection of human rights during the COVID pandemic, I'd like to answer with 3 points. Firstly, we have been protecting the enjoyment of human rights of the Chinese people by placing people's life and safety above everything else. Secondly, during the pandemic control, we are also emphasizing on protecting people's livelihood by addressing specific concerns of the population during the pandemic. At various levels of the government, we have specific bodies to gather the data concerning the complaints of the people in China and try our best to solve those major problems. You perhaps have read in the media that in some places they overdid it. the adopted oversimplified approach in dealing with the pandemic. The central government has issued a specific instruction to change those problems. Thirdly, the question raised by Mr. Hannibal on setting up an open international cooperation mechanism. Well, firstly, with the WHO and the international community, we have been cooperating in a transparent and open way with them, and the cooperation is quite effective. Secondly, China has been taking part in the modification of international health regulation and the activities undertaken by WHO in the field of pandemic control. Thirdly, we'll continue to strengthen cooperation with the WHO and other international bodies in this field. I'll stop with this.
下面请公安部的同事。
Now, I'd like to pass the floor to my colleague from the Ministry of Public Security. You have 3 minutes.
好，谢谢。首先
Thank you. Regarding Ms. Lee's question on the pandemic, during pandemic, China enforced the law with the consideration of the impact of pandemic, and we handle the cases in a in a relevant, merciful way. Now we don't have a statistical data on the people arrested during pandemic, and the final result, final decision on these people were dependent on the factual of the activity and the consequences. As for the registration on use of drug and the drug rehabilitation, which was mentioned yesterday, China widely disseminate the information about the drug rehabilitation. Now, the number of people addicted with drugs has been reducing during the past 5 years. As for the registration for the drug users, China has a specific law requirement on this issue. The after the drug rehabilitation, there should be no discrimination on this person. In case of any discrimination, the person could file a complaint to the authority. As for the periodic test, there is no specific law requirement. Anyone could file the complaint if they feel any rights are violated. As for Mr. Humbel's question on the detention of human rights defenders, in China, anyone who violates the law shall be punished. The protection of the rights should be carried out in a lawful manner. If in the name of protection of laws, to carry out the criminal activities, such a person will be arrested, detained, and prosecuted. This also demonstrates the principle of everyone is equal in front of law. If there is any mistake in the detention, the person could file a complaint and could apply for a reparation. Thank you. I now give the floor to the Information Office to respond to relevant questions. I would like to respond to questions of Mr. Winford on the climate change issues. China has a national strategy on combating climate change. In 2020, the CO2 emission per unit of GDP has decreased for 48.4% compared to 2015. So as in this way, we achieved the goal ahead of schedule. In 2020, China put forward the goal to achieve the emission peaking before 2030 and achieving emission neutrality before 2060. China also strengthened the technical research and financial investment. Also, all regions have established the action plan on reaching the emission peaking. China has initiated the largest scale emission trade exchange. Also, we support other developing countries and stop building any new coal-fired power plants overseas. Climate change has become a independent chapter, including the emission cut and reducing the pollution to air, water, and soil. Another point to point out, the coal-fired power plants overseas mainly aim to benefit the developing countries. To abandon these projects is not fair to these recipient countries. Consideration should be given to local conditions, and the sustainable development should also be supported by the technological development. I give the floor to National Ethnic Affairs Commission to respond to questions. I'd like to respond to the questions of Mr. Winford on the poverty alleviation in ethnic minority areas. China's poverty alleviation efforts face to the poor people, including the poor ethnic minority groups. 420 poor areas are located in the ethnic minority areas. Such efforts was very important for local people to get out of poverty. Madam Saron has asked about the cultural protection of Hui group. Hui ethnic group is one of the ethnic minority groups. They have the autonomous region, autonomous province, and autonomous county. I have ever worked in one of the autonomous regions. The cultural rights were well protected locally. At that time, there were over 2,000 religious places. Some people made a joke that was even higher than the number of schools at the local place. Mr. Hannibal mentioned China's policy on ethnic groups facing the criticism from the international level. Whether or not the policies should be put under review and reconsideration. China has its system, which is constantly adjusted and improved. For the NPC, every year we receive the opinions from the representatives from ethnic minority groups. Based on these opinions, we further improve our system. As for the criticism from outside China, maybe some people do not fully understand the context of China, and we need to distinguish which are helpful opinions. For the helpful opinions, we'll observe to further improve our system. Thank you. I give the floor to the front work department to give additional information.
我还有2点。
I have a couple of things to add. As for the data of the boarding school in Tibet, I've just mentioned in Tibet, there were 290,000 school in boarding school, which is half of the students in Tibet. I've also noticed the statement from the special procedure. As for the figure 1 million, I don't know where is this figure from, but I have another figure. In 2020, the Tibetan population was 3.64 million. The minority groups account for 3.2 million. Based on my knowledge, the figure 1 million is probably not accurate. This is my response to the figure given by Madame Saron. Also, as for the relocation of residents, the relocation by 2019, 260,000 people were reallocated in the process of the poverty alleviation process. Most of them were the residents living in high altitude areas. The reallocation is on a voluntary basis. For those residents who are unwilling to leave their hometown, the local government also organized some cooperative consisting of some experts and medical staff to take care of the life, to take care of the livestock of the people reallocated. And the government will also have the local government will also pay periodic visits to the residents who decide to stay at home. For those people, reallocated people, they can choose to go back to their residence during summertime for livestocking and return to their new home in wintertime. Oh, time is up. However, I would like to give a brief chance to Hong Kong and Macau to give some additional information.
For safeguarding national security of the Hong Kong SAR. I believe the member of the committee was referring to the interpretation of the Standing Committee made on 30th of December 2022. I emphasize that the interpretation did not confer additional power on the chief executive or the committee in this respect, and only clarified that the provision is applicable in handling the controversy concerning overseas lawyers. The certificate issued under Article 47 of the National Security Law serves as a piece of evidence only, albeit conclusive in the case before the court. It is still for the court to decide on other issues and the outcome of the case. Therefore, there is no usurpation of the function of the court. The arrangement in this respect doesn't impair the independent judicial power of the Hong Kong courts. I'll next deal with the committee's question on the scope of the concept, acts endangering national security. As a matter of fact, no definition is provided for national security in the national security legislation of many countries. And the reason for that is threats to national security will change with circumstances. And this may be unanticipated or difficult to define in advance. Hence, it is necessary for the legislation to have a certain degree of flexibility. The Court of Final Appeal of the Hong Kong SAR has discussed the meaning of the term acts endangering national security
and did not point out that such term lacks sufficient certainty. The courts will handle applications for bail strictly in accordance with the law and act as a safeguard to prevent arbitrary deprivation of liberty. I now pass the time to my colleague.
On the question on bail arrangement, given the serious nature of offenses endangering national security and the severe danger to society, serious consequences will entail if the defendants continue with their crimes or abscond. Hence, the Hong Kong national security law introduces more stringent conditions to the grant of bail, with a view to effectively preventing, suppressing, and imposing punishment for offenses endangering national security. Under local laws in Hong Kong, bail will also not easily be granted for serious offenses, such as murder. The Hong Kong Court of Final Appeal has made clear in a case concerning Article 42(2) of the Hong Kong National Security Law that the cardinal importance of safeguarding national security and preventing and suppressing acts endangering national security explains why the Hong Kong National Security Law introduces more stringent conditions to the grant of bail in relation to offences endangering national security. And finally, on the issue of NS Hotline, the National Security Department of the Hong Kong Police Force has launched the National Security Department Reporting Hotline on the 5th of November 2020, with a view to facilitating members of the public to provide or report national security-related information. As at the 9th of February 2023, the hotline has received around 400,000 pieces of information. Thank you.
1 minute for Macau. 1 minute.
I'd like to the trade union is a long-term group. And the migrant workers contract has a certain period of validity. Therefore, we have the requirement that the trade union staff should the trade union should be consist of the local employees. The non-local employees can equally enjoy the same level of benefits as the local employees. When the contract terminates, the employees could have the further benefits of transport for them to go back to their home residence.
I thank the delegation for the answers given. Now we come to our closing remarks. First closing remarks shall be made by the country rapporteur, Mr. Windford. Few minutes. It's 5, it could be 3. It's up to you. Mr. Windford, you have the floor.
Let's count the seconds. Thanks to the delegation. Thanks for coming with such a large delegation, being well prepared, and that you have tried really to respond to the many questions we have posed to you and in an orderly way. Thanks also to the civil society organizations and all others who have provided us with extremely valuable information and shared a lot of additional thoughts and ideas with us, noticing that there have been many different positions in the civil society. Thanks also for the government to assuring that there will be no reprisals for anybody who has contributed to this process. You have presented yourself, I think from your opening remarks, Mr. Ambassador, as a country development oriented, or particularly with a social development orientation. I think many of our questions has to do with how to make these development paths really or fully human rights based. So we talked about transparency on all the policy implemented, in the participation of people potentially affected because they often know best what to do, to implement policies without any force or involuntary nature, to have a reliable legal system without arbitration, with freedom for lawyers and human rights defenders, and with respect for minorities, and also the, let's say, orientation of private actors and their responsibilities home and abroad. Yeah? So I think that has been our main focus areas. Our concluding observations will come out on Monday afternoon, and Mr. Sun, Monday the 6th, not next Monday, Monday the 6th, when the committee ends, you're right. And Mr. Sun has already said you will make sure that the concluding observations will be spread in your countries and probably in all relevant languages. Thanks for that. And we will indicate in the text also 3 areas of follow-up questions, which you can implement in the next 2 years. And it would be nice if you could give all the concluding observations the relevant or needed attention in the next process. I will conclude by thanking the Secretariat for technical support, which we had all the time. I want to say thank you to my task force colleagues and all other committee members who contributed to the process, and particularly to the translation service, this time also with a very able Chinese translation. And with that, I hand back the word to you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Winfour, for your closing remarks. Now the floor is for the head of delegation of China for a few minutes on closing remarks as well.
Thank you, Chair. Distinguished members of the committee, ladies and gentlemen. In the past 2 days, the Chinese delegation carried out constructive dialogue with members of the committee in an open and candid manner. We tried our best to present in a comprehensive and in-depth way the progress made in promoting and protecting economic, social, and cultural rights by the central government, as well as by the governments of the Hong Kong and Macau SARs since China's last review, and our plans to move forward. We listened attentively to the remarks made by the members of the committee, and we were deeply impressed by the responsible and professional approach shown by the rapporteur, the working group, and other members of the committee. Because of time constraint, some of the questions and data, we didn't have time to provide them, but we will try our best as soon as possible and in the most appropriate way provide you with this information. As to the concluding observations to be made by the committee, we will study them carefully through an intergovernmental mechanism. So long as they're in line with China's realities, we will accept them. As to the confusion caused, the misunderstanding, we are ready to carry out more communication and exchange with members of the committee so as to boost our mutual trust, address questions, and enhance mutual understanding. Mr. Chair, distinguished members of the committee, the realization of human rights depends on the condition of each country so that our effort can make sense. A standardized approach is not democratic, it is not appropriate and not fair. The covenant stipulates that the ideal of free human beings enjoying freedom from fear and want can only be achieved if conditions are created whereby everyone may enjoy this economic, social, and cultural rights. China attached importance to promoting all categories of human rights in a coordinated and equal way. The world is gripped by the impact of multifaceted crisis brought by the pandemic, climate change, economic, food, and energy situation. It requires the concerted efforts of all parties to guarantee economic, social, and cultural rights. China will, as always, cooperate with the committee and its members, support the committee in better fulfilling the lofty mission as mandated by the government relevant resolutions, and work tirelessly in realizing the rights enshrined in the covenant. The Chinese government sets great store by the review of various international human rights treaties to which China is a party, and we remain ready to carry out constructive dialogue and cooperation on human rights with various parties on the basis of equality and mutual respect, and join and promote jointly the sound development of international human rights cause. In conclusion, on behalf of the Chinese government, I would like to thank Mr. Chair for your outstanding leadership. My thanks also go to the rapporteur, the working group, members of the committee, the Secretariat, and the interpreters for their impressive contribution to the review. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Head of Delegation. In thanking the esteemed delegation of the Republic of China for the efforts and for the answers given, and in wishing you all a happy journey and a safe return home, I want to say that this dialogue has been very beneficial for the committee, good interaction, beneficial to us. Hope that is equally beneficial to you as well. An important reminder at the end. Of course, the committee will analyze, will look thoroughly and carefully to each and every answer given by each member of the delegation with a view to elaborating its concluding observations. An important thing to say, actually, a dialogue usually shows different approaches, variety in conceptual approaches here and there. But in the end, 2 points are important. One, that the covenant requires the progressive fulfillment of the obligations mentioned in it. But important to remember that the progressive fulfillment is not an end in itself. What is required by the provisions of the Charter itself is the full realization of the rights mentioned in the covenant. That's what is basically required and what we are all heading to. The second thing is that no matter what our conceptual approaches vary here and there, we all agree on one thing, that the overwhelming majority of human beings on the surface of this earth deserve better life and better future. Thank you all, delegation, colleagues in the committee, civil society, all those who are in the room, secretariat, and all those from UN Geneva who helped us throughout this meeting. Thank you all. And with this, the meeting with China is closed. Thank you very much.